Morning, everyone. Well, as Joe reminded us last week, we've been reading through the Gospel of Luke in this cycle, and we've been on the way to Jerusalem with Jesus. As we've been going through the past couple of weeks, we've been seeing this back and forth between Jesus and the religious leaders. 3 Sundays ago, when Jesus healed a lady in the synagogue on the Sabbath, he was criticized by the leaders of the synagogue for breaking the law. And then 2 Sundays ago, Jesus was a dinner guest at the house of the leader of the Pharisees, and this time Jesus took an opportunity to criticize. He criticizes the guests for all trying to get the seats of honor, and he criticizes kind of obliquely the host for not having invited the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind. So this week the ball is back in the Pharisees' court, and it's their turn to criticize Jesus. I like the way that this starts out. We know that the Pharisees are not happy. We're told that they were grumbling. That's the translation that we have here. Other translations translate that word as murmuring. Seems like the religious leaders like to grumble and murmur a lot about Jesus. This time their complaint is, look, this guy welcomes sinners and he eats with them. I think sometimes when we listen to readings from the Bible, they lose their impact on us because we've heard them so often over time, and sometimes it's hard for us to put ourselves back in the cultural context of 2,000 years ago. For devout Jews of Jesus' time, this was a serious accusation because God didn't like sinners. Sinners had broken God's law. They were cut off from God. Sinners were social outcasts for that very reason. Some sins would make the sinner unclean, and if other people came in contact with that person, they could become unclean too, and then they were cut off from God and from society. As a result of that, basically the only people that hung out with sinners were sinners. And so when the Pharisees criticize Jesus in this way, what they're really saying is, look at who this guy hangs out with. You know what kind of guy this is. He can't be the Messiah. He hangs out with sinners. And it's true. Jesus welcomed sinners. Sinners who hadn't repented yet, sinners who hadn't done the requisite rituals to get back into God's good graces, sinners who were still cut off from God and from society. And more than welcoming them, he ate with them. Eating a meal with somebody at that time was a huge social event. Even now in our days, it means a lot to invite somebody to your house and to have a meal with them. In the Greek translation of the word that we read as eats with, we're told that it also implies to associate with or to live on familiar terms with. So Jesus wasn't just ministering to sinners. He didn't just come into town and preach to them and heal them and then get out of Dodge. He hung around with them. He seemed to like to be with the sinners, liked being around them. And they seemed to like to be with him, because we're told that the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. Have you ever wondered why that might be? Have you ever wondered what Jesus was like? What was it about Jesus' person that attracted people in the way that he did? I think we can't discount that there was probably some kind of celebrity factor going on. People heard about Jesus, they wanted to see him. They were curious about the healings that he was doing. Much of his teaching was attractive to people, but not all of it. Some of it was a little off-putting. Some of it was hard to swallow for people of Jesus' time. I wonder if the reference to eating with sinners doesn't hint at a theory that a friend of mine told me a long time ago about why people like to be around Jesus. His theory was Jesus was fun to be around. Why? Because he liked to party. The Gospels don't say that in so many words, but there are a number of references that kind of seem to support it, as I found over the years. If you'll recall, Jesus is often depicted as being at dinner or being at a feast. He seems to like to be around feasts. Jesus himself, earlier in Luke's gospel, mentions that people criticized John the Baptist because he went out into the desert and he didn't eat, and they said he was crazy. And Jesus says, and the Son of Man comes and he eats and drinks, and they call him a glutton and a drunkard. Now, I doubt that Jesus was a glutton and a drunkard. I think that was probably an exaggeration, another nasty dig by the Pharisees and the religious leaders. But it is clear that Jesus liked feasts. He doesn't deny that he liked to eat and drink. And when he needed a metaphor for heaven, what is heaven like? What did he choose? It's like a big feast. It's a wedding feast. It's a feast where everybody comes and where people are even pulled in off the streets. Whenever I think about that, I often think of a line from a Billy Joel song, Only the Good Die Young, and the line is this: I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. The sinners are much more fun. Maybe Jesus preferred to laugh and eat and drink wine and be with the social outcasts than to stand on the sidelines and grumble with the Pharisees and the scribes about who was following the law and who wasn't. In any event, to get back to the grumbling Pharisees, Jesus did have a response for them. He responds with parables, which is, we're told by scripture scholars, Jesus' preferred way of teaching. And the first parable is about sheep, which is a metaphor that Jesus also likes to use a lot. Jesus tells them, which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that's lost until he finds it? He says this as if it's self-evident, as if everybody would, of course, go out and do this. I don't know if any of you have sheep or ever have had sheep. We did when I was younger. And I've often wondered to myself if the shepherds in the crowd weren't going, me? I wouldn't leave the 99 and go look for the one. That would be crazy, because sheep are stupid. You leave the 99, and when you come back, they're going to be gone. They're either going to walk off, or some wolf or wild animal is going to come along and get them, or somebody else is going to come along and steal them. And yeah, of course, if a shepherd did leave the 99 and went to find the one and was lucky enough to find him and came back and was lucky enough to still have his 99, of course he'd be happy. But is he going to go home and call all the neighbors together and all of his relatives and say, hey, I found my sheep? Seems a little excessive. And it's the same with the woman with the coin. Sure, she'd be happy that she found her coin, but calling all the neighbors in, calling all her friends, it's a little crazy. But maybe that's Jesus' point. He says when a sinner repents, when somebody has turned away from God and they've come back to God, there's that kind of crazy joy in heaven. They're crazy happy about it. More joy than over the 99 who didn't get lost. 99 who stayed on the straight and narrow. More joy over the one that got lost and came back. Doesn't make sense, does it? And we haven't even gotten to the next parable, which is the prodigal son. You all know that one, I'm sure. Since I was a kid, I have always empathized with the older brother in that story. Do you remember it? The younger brother goes off, gets half of his inheritance from his father, squanders it all, and then after years shows up and goes, here I am. And the father, instead of chastising him, throws a huge party and invites everybody in, and the older son says, I've done everything you asked of me for all this time, and not once did you even let me throw a small party for my friends. Doesn't seem fair, does it? Doesn't seem to make sense. But in that very moment, despite having been obedient all that time, the older son steps out of the straight and narrow. He tries to impose his will on the father. He wants to shrink the Father's generosity down to his measure. I think we all like to think that we're one of the 99 good sheep, but I have a suspicion that at least at some point in our lives, we're going to be the one. Because our measure is not God's measure. Because the way we see the world is not the way God sees the world. Because our wisdom is not God's wisdom. And at some point in our life, there's a high likelihood that we're going to stop and look around and say, shoot, where am I? I don't know how many of you prayed the Psalms. Just yesterday evening, I was at dinner and somebody mentioned that if they got stranded on a desert island and they only had one book of the Bible to have with them, they would want the Psalms because there's so much in them. Because there are so many human situations that require prayer that the Psalms address. The one we just read this morning, Psalm 51, I think is one of the great ones. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness. In your great compassion, blot out my offense. I think maybe you have to have a certain amount of life experience before this psalm really speaks to you. You have to, at least in my case, get past the point when you're younger, when you do think like the older brother, oh yeah, I've always adhered to the straight and narrow. Because life isn't always easy. Sometimes the choices that we have to make aren't that clear. This psalm is an acknowledgement that we don't always live the way we should, the way that we want to live. It's an acknowledgement of God's justice. But it's also a request for forgiveness, yes, but not just for that. Also for healing, for renewal, for God's help. Let's listen again to a few lines from Psalm 51. This is actually from a different translation. Indeed, you love truth in the heart. Then in the secret of my heart, teach me wisdom. A pure heart create for me, O God. Put a steadfast spirit within me. Give me again the joy of your help. With a spirit of fervor, sustain me. My friends, we're human beings. We have a limited view of life, and we have a limited view of God. We assume that God is going to react to things in the way that we would. Jesus tells us that God is much more generous in his love than we can ever imagine. But he also challenges us to emulate that love, and that's a tall order for us. If we want to hope to make progress, we're going to need the help of God's Spirit to create that pure heart in us. But we're also going to have to trust that if we miss the mark, if we get lost, God will drop everything to find us, and we'll be crazy happy when we're back home.
Turning to page 358, let us stand and say together the words of the Nicene Creed. We believe